The echo that shook him. The lights in Studio 6B were warm and glowing, casting a soft golden hue across the iconic Tonight Show set. The energy was high, as always, with the audience packed wall to wall, clapping in rhythm to the Roots' upbeat intro. Jimmy Fallon, dressed in a sleek navy suit and striped tie, flashed his signature boyish grin as the applause slowly settled. He glanced off stage, hands animated, eyes sparkling. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, almost bouncing on his toes, "you know him, you love him, the one and only Keanu Reeves." The audience erupted, not just applause, but pure, heartfelt joy. Keanu Reeves walked out humbly, hands folded in front of him, nodding slightly, almost shy despite the thunderous welcome. He was dressed in a black suit, effortlessly cool, his hair slightly tousled and the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He gave Fallon a brief hug before sitting down, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees in that calm, zen-like posture that seemed to define him. Jimmy leaned forward, elbows on his desk, his excitement barely contained. "Keanu, man, you're just too cool. You walk out here and it's like the whole place becomes church." Silent awe. Keanu laughed gently. "Thanks, Jimmy, that's very kind." They spoke about his new film, an emotional sci-fi drama about memory, loss, and second chances. Keanu, ever humble, deflected compliments and praised the director, the writers, the crew, even the catering team. Jimmy joked about getting a role just to taste that food. The audience laughed, clapped, and it was shaping up to be one of those episodes, smooth, joyful, unforgettable. Until it happened. It started low, like a hum, almost indistinct. At first, no one noticed except Keanu. His expression didn't change dramatically. No gasp, no startle, but something shifted in his eyes. That warmth, that gentle calm, suddenly dimmed. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something others couldn't hear. His fingers tensed slightly on the armrest, then relaxed. Jimmy was mid-sentence, laughing at one of his own jokes, but then paused, catching the subtle change in Keanu's face. "You good?" Jimmy asked, smiling but slightly unsure. Keanu didn't answer. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them and looked directly at Jimmy, not the playful, showbiz glance, but a stare that came from somewhere much deeper. Then, softly but firmly, he said something that turned the room silent. "Can we stop for a second?" The audience quieted. You could hear someone shifting in their seat. Jimmy blinked, unsure if Keanu was playing a bit. "Stop like the show?" Jimmy asked, his voice a mix of confusion and concern. Keanu nodded. "Just a moment, please, I need a second." Without waiting for a cue or explanation, Keanu stood up. He walked slowly toward the back of the set, near the curtains, eyes searching, scanning the edges of the studio like someone trying to spot a ghost. The camera awkwardly zoomed out, and the director in the control room was whispering frantic instructions, unsure whether to cut to commercial or follow Keanu. Then it came again, the sound. This time clearer, a soft chime, a wind-up toy melody, innocent and haunting, a lullaby tune. And this time the mic caught it. It floated across the studio like a whisper from a memory. Keanu stopped walking, his breath hitched visibly in his chest. He turned slowly toward the sound and muttered something under his breath that only the nearest floor assistant caught. "No, it can't be." Jimmy had stood up by now, following from a distance, unsure what was happening but sensing that this was no joke, no PR stunt, no scripted twist. Keanu reached into the shadows behind a curtain where a small stagehand was crouched, checking wires. Sitting beside the equipment was a tiny, old-fashioned music box. Not studio equipment, not a prop, just there. Keanu bent down, touched it gently, and as soon as his fingers met the smooth, worn wood, the music stopped. He stood there, holding the box in his hand, unmoving, as if the world had paused for him. The audience watched in suspended disbelief. Jimmy looked toward the producers, who were now equally frozen. Something about that moment was too human, too personal to interrupt with laughter or commercials. Then Keanu whispered something, quiet, shaken, fragile. That was hers. It wasn't until much later, after the taping ended early, after the studio lights dimmed and the crowd had been dismissed gently without answers, that the story began to unfold. A story no one in the entertainment industry had heard in full before. A piece of Keanu's soul that had remained hidden from cameras, from magazines, from the lights and lenses of fame. But that night it cracked open. Jimmy found him backstage, sitting alone with the music box in his lap, elbows on his knees, staring into the distance. Not crying, not broken, just remembering. Keanu, Jimmy said gently, kneeling beside him. What was that? Keanu looked at him, not like a celebrity to a talk show host, but like one man to another. Equal, honest, human. That sound, Keanu said, voice low and thick. I haven't heard it in almost 25 years. It was hers, Jennifer's, my fiancée. Jimmy's face softened instantly. He had read headlines years ago, vague ones about a tragic loss. But they were old stories, never confirmed in full. Most people thought they were just tabloid whispers long buried. She had that music box when we met, Keanu continued. It was the first gift I ever gave her, played it for her when she was in the hospital the last time. He stopped, closed his eyes, took a breath. I don't know how it got here, Jimmy, he whispered. But hearing that melody, it was like time collapsed, like she was in the room. Jimmy sat beside him, no cue cards, no jokes, just presence. The crew stayed back. No one dared intrude, not in a moment that's sacred. Later, the show would cut that part from airing, but the story would travel, slowly, respectfully, not in headlines but in whispers, about a moment when the most untouchable man in Hollywood showed the most untouchable grief, and the world listened. That night, Keanu left the studio quietly. He didn't go to the after-party, didn't return calls. He went home, sat on his couch, played the music box again and again, each note carving memories into the silence. And then something strange happened. He picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't dialed in years. And as it rang, something inside him trembled, not in fear but in readiness, because something was coming. Something long buried was rising, not just pain but truth and healing. What began as an interview was now the beginning of a reckoning. And the world would never see Keanu Reeves the same way again. The call that reopened everything. The night air outside the studio was colder than usual, the kind of chill that seemed to cling to skin and memory alike. Keanu stood by the curb, the music box in his hand, unnoticed by the small crowd lingering near the exit. The city buzzed around him, taxis honking, distant chatter, neon signs blinking their hypnotic rhythm. But to him, everything was strangely quiet. It wasn't just the kind of silence that followed shock. It was the silence of something inside him moving again, something he had buried under years of stillness and numb survival. He turned the music box in his hand, thumb brushing the brass latch. The wooden lid was still faintly scratched from the day he dropped it in a hospital hallway 2 decades ago. He remembered the moment like it had just happened. The clatter on the tiles, the echo, the way the nurse looked at him with such helpless pity that he had walked away and never looked back. But now it had returned, as if time was no longer willing to let him forget. His driver waited at the edge of the curb, door open, but Keanu didn't move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old contact list, not digital, not stored on the cloud, but a small leather notebook with pages yellowed at the edges. Most people would have laughed at how old-fashioned it was. But for Keanu, there were numbers in there that didn't belong in the modern world, numbers that tied to a different version of him. A younger man, a man who still believed love could last forever. His fingers stopped at one name. Maya Rivers, Jennifer's best friend, the last person he had spoken to on the day of the funeral. The woman who had cried harder than anyone else because she had been there from the beginning, from the first date, from the night Keanu had proposed in a quiet cabin while it snowed outside. Maya had seen the whole arc of that love story, from laughter to tragedy. Keanu stared at her number. He hadn't called her in 20 years. She had tried a few times, sent letters, left voicemails, but he never responded. Not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't. The pain was too close to the surface, and even kindness became unbearable when it reminded him of what he'd lost. But now, with the music box in his hand and the echoes still bouncing in his chest, he needed answers. He dialed. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice, tired but familiar, answered. "Hello," she said, cautious, unsure of the unknown number. Keanu's voice cracked as he spoke. "Maya." Silence. Then a slow intake of breath. "Keanu." He felt it then, the weight of 20 years pressing into his chest like a floodgate giving way. I found the music box." Another silence, but this one wasn't empty. It was full of emotion that had been waiting too long to be spoken. "Where?" she whispered. "Tonight at the Tonight Show, backstage, just sitting there. I don't know how, but I heard it and it stopped me cold." He didn't know if he expected her to laugh or cry, or tell him it was impossible. But instead, she said something that made his entire body stiffen. Keanu, that's not possible. I've had it. He blinked, confusion turning to disbelief. What? I've had the music box all these years. I kept it after the funeral. I never told you. I thought you didn't want anything that reminded you of her, so I kept it. It's in my house right now on the shelf above her old diary. The words dropped like stones in his stomach. Then what was this box in his hand? Keanu looked at it again. Same scratches, same carving on the side, the initials J+K etched with a pocket knife on a snowy evening. Maya, he said slowly, then what the hell am I holding? The line was silent. Then Maya said the words that turned his world completely upside down. Keanu, are you sitting down? He leaned against the wall of the studio, legs suddenly weak. Jennifer, she wrote something before she passed. Something she told me to give you if the music ever found you again. His breath caught in his throat. What do you mean if the music found me? She said the box had a twin, one she made with her father when she was 12. She never told anyone. She said, one day if you ever heard it again without expecting to, if it reached you like an echo, you'd know it was time to come home. That's what she called it, coming home to your own heart. Keanu stared at the city lights but didn't see them. He saw only Jennifer, her smile, the way she walked, the way her fingers traced the piano keys, and how her voice used to hum that exact melody when she cooked or when she was afraid. A sound that had meant safety. A sound that now came back not by logic, not by reason, but by something deeper, something unspoken. I need to see you, Keanu said quietly, tonight. Maya didn't hesitate. I'm still in Vermont, same house, I never moved. He nodded even though she couldn't see him. I'll be there by morning. He ended the call and turned to his driver. We're going to Vermont. The man blinked. Right now, sir. Right now. No hesitation. The drive took nearly 5 hours through the winding backroads of New York to Vermont. Keanu didn't sleep. He sat upright the whole time, the music box on his lap, and for the first time in years he wasn't thinking about scripts or schedules or the next day's meeting. He was thinking about a cabin with frost on the windows, a voice lost to time, and the chance that perhaps grief didn't have to be a cage. Maybe it was a doorway, one you entered when the soul was finally ready. Maya met him at the door, older now, with streaks of silver in her hair, but her eyes still held that fierce protective kindness. They didn't speak at first, just hugged. A long, aching hug that had too many words buried in it. Inside, the house was dimly lit, quiet except for the crackle of a fireplace. Keanu set the music box on the table, and Maya stared at it like a ghost had entered her home. She walked slowly to the shelf, pulled down her own copy. They placed them side by side. Identical. One carved by Jennifer's hand, the other its twin, seemingly lost to time. How did this get to the studio? Maya whispered. Keanu shook his head. I don't know, but I think she's trying to tell me something. Maya handed him a faded envelope. Jennifer's handwriting, a note never opened, Keanu's name scrawled across the front in gentle curves. His hands trembled. He sat, took a breath, opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper. And on it only a few lines. Keanu, if you're reading this, it means the melody reached you. I told you it would. I told you love doesn't vanish, it echoes. You've run long enough. It's time to stop. It's time to feel again. And it's okay. She's waiting for you. But not in the past. In the future. Find her. Love again. Promise me that. Jennifer. The room was still. Keanu folded the letter, his throat tight, his eyes burning with a pain he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. But it wasn't just grief. It was release. A key turning in a lock inside his chest. He looked at Maya, then at the twin music boxes, then out the window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the hills. And for the first time in 20 years, Keanu Reeves whispered something he hadn't dared believe. Maybe I'm not alone anymore. The girl in the red bookstore. The morning sun stretched across the hills of Vermont like a memory being remembered, slow and warm, casting golden light on the frost-laced windows of Maya's old house. Keanu stood outside on the wooden porch, wrapped in a woolen coat, staring into the endless quiet of pine trees and rolling fog. His hands were buried in his pockets, but the music box still pressed against his chest from inside. He had not slept. He had not needed to. There was a strange electricity running through his blood now, not adrenaline, not fear, something deeper. It was as if someone had whispered a forgotten secret into his bones, and now everything in him was beginning to awaken. Inside, Maya moved softly through the kitchen, making coffee the way she always had, adding a touch of cinnamon the way Jennifer used to like it. The smell drifted to the porch, and Keanu turned as she stepped out, 2 mugs in her hand. He took one without words. They sipped in silence for a while, listening to birdsong that sounded like a forgotten lullaby between the trees. "I haven't left this house in months," Maya said finally, her voice low and worn. "But I've never once felt alone here." Keanu looked at her, a question in his eyes. She nodded slowly. "Because I still feel her, not like a ghost, not in a creepy way, just like she never really left, as if some part of her is still moving through these walls, waiting for you to come back." Keanu didn't reply. He didn't have to. Everything about him, the stillness in his shoulders, the tear he hadn't wiped from the corner of his eye, spoke louder than words. Maya placed her mug on the railing and walked back inside. When she returned, she was holding a small leather-bound notebook, worn from years of being read and reread. She handed it to Keanu without a word. He opened it slowly and instantly recognized Jennifer's handwriting. It wasn't just a diary. It was a collection of thoughts, letters, pages she had written for him but never sent. Notes of love, fears, hopes for a life they never got to build. A future they had dreamed of during quiet nights, lying beside each other as the world outside seemed too big to matter. One page stopped him cold. It was dated 2 weeks before her final hospitalization. "If I ever go and he stays, I hope he doesn't close the door. I hope he finds someone who laughs with her whole body. I hope she's not afraid of silence. I hope he teaches her how to make tea the wrong way, and they laugh about it for years. I hope he remembers that his love was never just mine. It belongs to the world. And someone somewhere still needs it." Keanu closed the notebook gently, eyes burning, his soul quieted by a pain that no longer screamed. It simply existed. Not as a wound, but as a scar. A mark that whispered he had survived, and that surviving meant there was more still to do. Later that day, after Maya had gone to rest and the snow began falling softly over the landscape, Keanu sat alone by the fire. He stared into the flames and then reached for his phone, not for work, not for press, not for Hollywood, but for something real. He dialed a number he had scribbled on the back of a receipt weeks ago. A stranger's number. Someone he had met by chance, but who had said something then that now echoed differently. Her name was Lena, a woman who ran a used bookstore in Brooklyn. He had stumbled into her shop after a long day of interviews, hiding from the paparazzi, trying not to be noticed. She hadn't recognized him at first. She offered him tea, smiled shyly, then scolded him when he left a book out of place. He'd laughed for the first time in days. They'd talked briefly about poetry, silence, and the way stories sometimes choose us instead of the other way around. He had left his number behind, scribbled inside the cover of a book of Rumi poems. She had texted once, thanking him. He never replied, not because he wasn't interested, but because back then he hadn't been ready. Now he was. The phone rang once. Twice. Then her voice answered, soft, curious. "Hello." Keanu cleared his throat, feeling foolish and brave at the same time. "Hey, it's Keanu, from the bookstore." A pause, then a smile in her voice. "The man who put Naruto in the wrong section." He chuckled, "Yeah, guilty. I thought you forgot me." "I didn't, I just wasn't ready to remember you." There was silence, but it was warm, like a door opening, not closing. "I'm in Vermont," he said quietly. "But I think I need to come back to Brooklyn. There's something there I left unfinished." "Me?" "No," he said softly, "me." They talked for a while about nothing important and everything that mattered. And when the call ended, Keanu didn't feel lost anymore. He felt like he was walking again, towards something, not away. The next day he drove back to New York. This time not for a press tour, not for a talk show, but for a conversation he was finally strong enough to have. He stopped first at the bookstore. It was quiet inside, the kind of place that smelled like memory and forgotten paperbacks. Lena was behind the counter, tying a ribbon around a donated stack. When she saw him, she didn't gasp or shout or ask for an autograph. She just smiled. "Coffee still bad," she said, but the tea's better. He walked toward her, each step heavy and light at the same time. She pointed to the poetry section. I saved a spot for Rumi, right next to Neruda, thought they might get along. He laughed, and for a moment everything else faded, the pain, the years, the silence, and in its place something new bloomed, not to replace what had been lost, but to honor it, to build from it. They sat in the back of the store for hours, talking, laughing, and somewhere between her stories about stubborn customers and his stories about movies he never wanted to be in, Keanu found something he hadn't expected to find in a dusty corner of Brooklyn. Hope, not the kind you chase. The kind that finds you when you finally stop running. When you stop running, the world finds you. The snow hadn't melted yet in Vermont, but in New York, the first signs of spring had begun to stretch their way across the concrete. Slivers of green peeked from between bricks where no gardener had touched, and storefronts cracked their windows to let in air that smelled like thawing earth and second chances. Keanu Reeves sat at a corner table in the back of the red bookstore, a steaming cup of jasmine tea between his hands, and a notebook open before him, one that once belonged to a woman he loved more than life. Yet today, the pages didn't feel like tombstones. They felt like permission, like a whisper from the past that said, you can live now, you can love again. Lena moved between the shelves like a poet lost in rhythm, brushing her fingers across spines, occasionally rearranging the fiction section with a stubbornness Keanu found oddly charming. She hadn't asked him for details about the music box. She hadn't pushed when he grew quiet mid-sentence or drifted into a silence that stretched too long. She simply existed with him, fully, present, undemanding. There was a stillness in her presence that didn't press against his grief. It made space for it. And for the first time in years, Keanu realized that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering without collapsing. That evening, after the bookstore closed and the final customer had wandered out with a smile and an armful of paperbacks, Lena dimmed the lights and joined him near the window. She handed him a piece of chocolate and sat across from him, legs folded, sleeves pushed up, the fire from the old heater flickering golden against her cheek. Tell me about her, she said, not demanding but inviting. Keanu looked down at the notebook, his fingers resting on the soft leather cover. She loved stars, he said quietly. Not just looking at them, she used to memorize the constellations. She'd lie on her back and tell stories about why they were placed the way they were, like they were letters in the sky spelling out something no one else could read. Lena smiled gently. That sounds beautiful. She was, he replied, voice barely above a whisper. But after she died, it was like someone stole the night sky. The room grew still, not heavy, just reverent. Keanu looked up at her. You ever lose someone like that? Lena looked away for a moment, then nodded. My brother, cancer, we were kids. He was the one who taught me to read. Used to sit beside me, sounding out the big words. After he was gone, I couldn't read for a year. Every sentence felt like a betrayal. They sat in that shared space of knowing, not comparing wounds, but recognizing the shape of the same ache. Then Keanu asked, almost afraid to hear his own voice, why didn't you ask me about the box? Lena took a breath, then said, because whatever brought it to you didn't come to be explained, it came to be felt. Some things don't want answers, they want acknowledgement. That night, Keanu stayed late at the store, helping her box unsold inventory and carry crates into the back room. And while neither of them spoke of it directly, a rhythm began to form between them, not romantic yet, not labeled, but undeniably present. It was as if the universe had drawn a soft line from two very different points in time and space, letting their lives intersect in this quiet bookstore with bad tea and dusty floors. 3 days later, Jimmy Fallon called. Not a producer, not an assistant, Jimmy himself. The call came just after noon. Keanu was walking through Prospect Park, alone, lost in thought, watching a little girl try to catch a squirrel with a pretzel. Jimmy's voice on the line was half nervous, half earnest. Hey man, listen, I've been thinking about the show, about that night. Keanu stopped walking. Yeah. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not really, but people noticed. They felt it. The audience, the crew, hell, even the lighting guy came up to me and said, that wasn't just a celebrity having a moment, was it? Keanu exhaled slowly. It wasn't a moment, it was something breaking open. Jimmy was quiet for a second. Would you come back? Keanu frowned. Why? Because I think people need to see that. Not just the fame, not just the next movie trailer. They need to see what it means to stop running from grief. They need to see someone who can carry pain with dignity and still find joy. Keanu paused. He looked up at the sky. A single cloud floated lazily overhead. "Let me think about it," he said, not with resistance but contemplation. That night, he told Lena about the invitation. She didn't encourage him, she didn't discourage him. She simply asked, "Is your story ready to be heard?" Keanu stared at her for a long moment. "No," he said honestly, "but maybe it's ready to begin." So a week later, Keanu Reeves returned to Studio 6B. No announcement, no press blast, no audience beyond the crew and Jimmy himself. The set was bare, no props, just 2 chairs, a camera, and the same soft lights that had witnessed the moment everything changed. Jimmy stood as Keanu entered. They hugged, not for show, not for ratings, but as 2 people who had witnessed something sacred together. "You good?" Jimmy asked. Keanu nodded. "I'm not afraid of the sound anymore." And when they sat and the camera began to roll, the world didn't get a performance. They got truth. Keanu told the story of the music box, of Jennifer, of Maya, of the letter, of the bookstore, of a woman who didn't ask him to be okay but allowed him to be whatever he needed to be. He didn't cry for show. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the truth. And the sound that once haunted him now lived again in the background of something bigger. Healing. And as the interview ended, Jimmy asked, "So what happens now?" Keanu looked into the camera, and with a small smile that trembled but held, he said, Now I let life find me again. What we carry and what carries us." The morning after the interview aired, something unexpected happened. Not on television, but in living rooms across the world, in hospital beds, in quiet corners of bookstores, and on city trains. It wasn't just that the world was stunned that Keanu Reeves, a man who had always been quiet, dignified, and famously private, had chosen to speak about grief so openly. It was how he had done it, with no tears for attention, no theatrics, no carefully rehearsed lines. Just truth spoken slowly, like someone who had waited decades for the right moment and the right silence to finally say what mattered. And that silence didn't just reach fans, it reached those who were broken, the widows, the fathers who had buried sons, the women who kept old letters in drawers they no longer opened, the men who never spoke about their losses because the world told them to stay strong. Keanu's words became a soft place to fall, an invitation not to be healed but to be honest. To admit that love, when lost, doesn't disappear, it echoes in places we least expect, asking gently if we're ready to feel again. That morning, the red bookstore was quiet. Lena stood behind the counter, flipping through the pages of a returned novel, her eyes drifting to the window every few minutes. She hadn't said it, but Keanu had noticed. Ever since the night he told her about the second music box, she had looked at him differently. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with understanding. A knowing that comes from someone who has also had to walk barefoot across the shards of memory, bleeding but moving anyway. When the door opened and Keanu stepped inside, she didn't speak right away. He walked slowly to the counter, his hand resting on the wood, the same place where just weeks ago he had first stood lost, guarded, tired of the noise of the world. But now something was different. There was a stillness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, not the stillness of numbness, but of acceptance, of peace beginning to bloom where only pain had lived before. "People are talking," she said softly, placing the book down. "I know," he replied, "but I'm not." She tilted her head slightly. "Do you regret it?" He shook his head. "No, I think I regret staying silent for so long. I spent years thinking that grief had to be hidden. That pain made me weak. But that music box and you reminded me that some echoes aren't meant to haunt us. They're meant to bring us back." Lena smiled, but her eyes glistened. He reached into his coat pocket and placed the twin music box on the counter. She looked at it, but didn't touch it. "I want you to keep it," he said. Her eyebrows lifted. "Keanu." "No," he interrupted gently. "Not because I don't want it, but because this box found its way to me when I had forgotten how to feel. Now it's time for it to find someone else. I want it to be here, in this store, so that maybe someday another lost soul walks in and hears something they didn't know they needed." Lena stared at him for a long time, then nodded. She picked up the box, walked to a wooden shelf near the poetry section, and placed it carefully beside a framed photo of her brother and a copy of Rumi's The Soul of Love. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then she turned back to him. "You said you were done running. What now?" Keanu smiled, but it wasn't the red carpet smile the world knew. It was softer, realer. I'm thinking of staying in the city for a while, no film projects, no press, just days like this. And what do days like this look like? He shrugged. Tea that tastes like the past, long walks in the park, and maybe helping someone rearrange books incorrectly. She laughed. I'll allow it, as long as Neruda doesn't end up in science fiction again. The bell above the door rang as a young woman stepped in with a toddler clutching a stuffed bear. The little boy's eyes darted to the music box, his tiny hand reaching out, then retreating shyly. Keanu watched the child for a moment, then leaned toward Lena. Do you ever think the people we've lost still find ways to guide us? She glanced at the box, at the child, at the sunbeams streaking through the dust in the air. I think they never left. I think we just stopped listening. That evening, as dusk fell over Brooklyn and the last customers left, Keanu stayed behind to help Lena close up. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. He swept the floor while she counted the till, and it felt like something ancient and simple, companionship that asked for nothing but presence. Before he left, he looked around the bookstore once more. Have you ever wondered, he said slowly, if the world gives us the same story twice but asks us to choose differently the second time? Lena leaned against the doorway, her silhouette framed by golden light. Only every day. He walked out into the quiet street, the city humming around him. The night was gentle, no harsh wind, just the rustling of trees, the distant sound of laughter from a restaurant down the block, and the slow beat of his own heart, steady now, unafraid. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't need to. He had carried Jennifer with him long enough to know that grief doesn't leave, it transforms. Into wisdom, into softness, into a kind of strength that doesn't roar but whispers. And maybe, just maybe, the music that once broke him open was now guiding him home. Not to the past, but to everything waiting to be lived. The letter he wrote but never sent. The days that followed became a quiet rhythm, slow mornings filled with light through bookstore windows, afternoons spent in back corners sipping tea and moving through pages, and evenings wrapped in conversations that asked for no answers, just the courage to sit in what was real. Keanu Reeves didn't go back to Hollywood. Not yet. The contracts waited. The agents understood or pretended to. The world still turned, but he had stepped off the wheel not out of rebellion, but because for the first time in decades, he had given himself permission to stop surviving and start feeling. And somewhere between the aisles of stories written by others, Keanu began writing again, not a script, not a journal, but something more intimate. It started as a way to organize the chaos still curled around his ribs, but soon it became a conversation, not with the world, not even with Lena, but with Jennifer, not to bring her back, but to finally let her go, not in grief, but in gratitude. He chose a brown leather-bound journal from the poetry section, unmarked, clean, but slightly uneven, as if it, too, had a story waiting to be filled. Every day for a week he returned to the back table, a pen in hand, and wrote her a letter. Not one letter, but many. One for each of the memories he had buried. One for each of the things he never had the strength to say. He wrote about their long walks by the beach, about the time he missed her laugh so badly he tried to recreate it in his head and failed. He wrote about the night he didn't show up to her hospital room, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't bear to see her in pain. He wrote about the guilt, the numbness, the years of loneliness wrapped in fame, and how silence had become his only companion until a melody cut through it like a thread of light. And on the final page, he wrote one last letter, the one that shook him the most, the one he had been holding inside for 20 years. Dear Jennifer, I thought love was something I could only experience once. That what we had was so rare, so sacred, that losing you meant I had to live the rest of my life as a tribute to what we were. But now I realize that would be a disservice to you. You didn't love me so I could live half a life. You didn't smile so that I would carry sorrow in your name. You loved me with all you had, and you deserved for that love to become a seed, not a tombstone. There's someone now, I don't know what she means yet, but she listens, she sees, and she doesn't try to fix me. She just stays. And I think if you were still here, you'd tell me that's exactly what I needed. Thank you for the music, for the memories, for loving me when I didn't yet know how to love myself. I'll carry you always. But from here on, I'll also walk forward. I hope that's okay. Love, Keanu. He closed the notebook slowly, fingers trembling not from sadness but from release. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic crescendo, Just a man sitting in a bookstore, letting go of something he had once thought he couldn't survive losing. And in doing so, he realized something quiet and profound. Grief does not end when we move on. It softens when we move with it. That evening, Lena found him by the poetry shelf again. She was holding 2 mugs, one for him, one for her. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't ask what he had written. She only said, "Would you like to walk?" They walked side by side down a quiet street, past closed bakeries and cafes still glowing with end-of-day laughter. The night air was cool, brushing against their coats, but neither of them spoke. Not until they reached a bench overlooking the East River. Keanu sat first, the journal on his lap. Lena looked out over the water. What's next? He thought for a long moment. Forgiveness, he said finally. Of myself, of time, of the things I couldn't control. And after that? He smiled gently. Maybe beginnings. She nodded and for a moment leaned her shoulder against his. No expectation, no declaration, just presence. And in that presence, Keanu felt it, not Jennifer's absence, but her approval. Not as a ghost, not as a whisper, but as something woven into the wind, into the music box now resting in the store, into the laughter he had rediscovered, and the woman beside him who never asked him to heal, but quietly made space for it. Weeks later, Keanu made a choice. He published the letters not as a bestseller, not as a spectacle, but as a small, quiet book titled The Echo We Follow. It didn't top charts, it didn't trend, but it found its way into hospital waiting rooms, therapy circles, grief retreats, and hearts that had long forgotten how to beat without guilt. People who had lost someone found themselves in those pages, and in doing so, they found the courage to write their own. Jimmy Fallon invited him back on the show. This time, the story wasn't about a movie, it was about the book, about what it meant to tell the truth in a world full of filters. As they sat together again under the studio lights, Jimmy asked, "If you could go back to that moment, the sound, the silence, the sudden stop, would you change anything?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "because that sound didn't stop me, it started me." The crowd was quiet, not out of discomfort, but reverence. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, a young woman who had lost her father months before clutched a copy of The Echo We Follow to her chest and cried, not because it hurt, but because for the first time in weeks, she felt seen. Back at the bookstore, the music box still sat on the shelf. Lena dusted around it carefully every morning. People didn't touch it. Some didn't notice it. But every now and then, someone would pause by that shelf, tilt their head as if they heard something, and smile to themselves. One evening, Keanu stood beside that shelf again. And this time, instead of sorrow, he whispered, "Thank you." Not just to Jennifer, not just to Lena, but to the silence, to the wound that taught him how to feel again, to the sound that broke him open and let the light pour in, and to the part of himself he had finally come home to,